The end of World War II created a rare and dangerous moment in history, a global vacuum of authority. Empires had collapsed, economies were shattered, and trust between nations was fragile. Leaders understood that simply ending the fighting was not enough. Without structure, chaos would return. The post-war order was therefore designed, not discovered. Institutions, alliances, and rules were deliberately constructed to prevent another total war. This design process was shaped by memory. The failure of the interwar period haunted every decision. Policymakers believed that instability, economic collapse, and uncoordinated diplomacy had enabled catastrophe. Stability became the primary objective, even if it required compromise. The new order prioritized predictability over justice and containment over reconciliation. This was not idealism. It was risk management shaped by fear. Understanding this moment is essential because it explains why the post-war world was built around systems rather than trust. Stability was engineered under the assumption that human behavior had not changed. Only structures could restrain it. The creation of the United Nations reflected both hope and limitation. It was designed to prevent another global war through dialogue, collective security, and international law. Unlike earlier attempts, it acknowledged power realities. Permanent members of the Security Council were granted veto power, ensuring that major powers would not be forced into conflict by the institution meant to prevent it. This design was pragmatic, not moral. It accepted inequality to preserve participation. The UN became a forum for legitimacy rather than enforcement. It could slow conflict, expose aggression, and coordinate humanitarian response, but it could not eliminate rivalry. This limitation was intentional. The organization was built to manage tension, not erase it. Understanding this distinction explains both the UN's endurance and its frustrations. It survives because it reflects reality rather than denying it. The post-war order did not aim for peace without conflict. It aimed for conflict without collapse. Economic recovery was treated as a security issue. Leaders understood that poverty and instability created fertile ground for extremism. Rebuilding economies was therefore strategic, not charitable. Reconstruction programs aimed to restore productivity, stabilize currencies, and reintegrate trade. This approach marked a departure from punitive post-war policies of the past. Economic interdependence was seen as a tool of peace. Prosperity would reduce incentives for conflict. This logic reshaped international finance and trade. Institutions were created to manage currency stability and reconstruction funding. The post-war order embedded economics into security planning permanently. This fusion explains why economic crises became matters of geopolitical concern. Recovery was not only about rebuilding what was lost, it was about shaping behavior through stability. The new order treated economics as the foundation of peace. Germany became the central problem the post-war order needed to solve. The memory of how the Treaty of Versailles had destabilized Europe after World War I shaped every decision. Punishment alone was no longer considered viable, yet allowing Germany to recover without constraints seemed equally dangerous. This contradiction defined post-war planning. Initially, Allied policy focused on demilitarization, occupation, and strict control of German industry. But this approach quickly collided with new realities. Europe's recovery depended on German economic participation. At the same time, tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union transformed Germany from a defeated enemy into a strategic asset. This shift fundamentally altered the post-war order. Reconstruction replaced punishment in the West, while political control intensified in the East. Germany was no longer treated as a single problem, but as two competing futures. The division of Germany was not an accident. It was a structural compromise between security fears and economic necessity. This decision stabilized Western Europe while freezing conflict at the center of the continent. Germany's post-war transformation reveals the core logic of the new order. Preventing collapse mattered more than resolving historical guilt. Stability was prioritized over closure. The collapse of European empires created a power vacuum the post-war order could not ignore. Colonial systems had relied on military dominance and political legitimacy, both of which were shattered by the war. As empires weakened, security could no longer be guaranteed unilaterally. The solution that emerged was alliance-based order. Instead of empires projecting control outward, blocks of states pooled military power inward. Alliances institutionalized protection and obligations simultaneously. Membership offered security but demanded alignment. This structure reduced uncertainty among allies while hardening divisions globally. Neutrality became increasingly difficult. The logic was not ideological idealism. It was fear of instability. Alliances promised predictability in a fractured world. They also transferred responsibility for security from individual states to collective systems. This marked a decisive break from pre-war geopolitics. Power was no longer informal or imperial. It was contractual. Nuclear weapons forced a radical transformation in strategic thinking. Traditional concepts of victory lost meaning in a world where total destruction could be mutual and instantaneous. Deterrence replaced conquest as the organizing principle of security. The goal was no longer to defeat the enemy, but to convince them that war would be catastrophic for all sides. This logic depended on credibility, not morality. Nations needed the capacity to retaliate even after suffering devastating attack. As a result, military planning became abstract and technical, focused on survivability, redundancy, and signaling. Deterrence stabilized relations at the highest level while destabilizing them elsewhere. Direct war between major powers became unthinkable, but indirect conflict expanded. Proxy wars, arms races, and political intervention replaced open confrontation. The new order accepted fear as a stabilizing force. This was not optimism. It was resignation shaped by experience. The world had seen what industrial war could do. Nuclear war promised far worse. Deterrence did not eliminate violence. It reorganized it. Understanding this logic explains why the post-war world felt permanently tense even without global war. Stability was achieved by balancing on the edge of catastrophe. Europe became the physical expression of the new order's contradictions. Recovery and division unfolded simultaneously. Western Europe pursued economic integration and political cooperation as safeguards against renewed conflict. Eastern Europe experienced enforced political alignment under Soviet influence. Borders hardened. Movement was restricted. Ideology became geography. This division was not temporary. It was institutionalized through military alliances, economic systems, and information control. Europe stabilized precisely because it stopped being fluid. Conflict was frozen rather than resolved. This condition reduced uncertainty at the cost of freedom and unity. The continent became predictable but fragmented. Germany's division symbolized this reality. It was both a solution and a wound. The new order prioritized containment over reconciliation. Europe's experience demonstrates the central trade-off of post-war stability. Peace achieved through separation carries long-term social and political cost. The division prevented immediate war, but it ensured that Europe would remain the central theater of global tension for decades. The post-war order was built primarily for Europe and North America. Elsewhere, its application was uneven and unstable. The war fatally weakened colonial authority. Colonized populations had mobilized, fought, and organized during the conflict. After 1945, imperial control could no longer be justified or enforced at scale. Decolonization accelerated rapidly, often violently. New states emerged under conditions of extreme pressure. Borders drawn during colonial rule rarely reflected social or ethnic realities. Institutions were fragile. Economic dependency persisted. The international system struggled to integrate these new actors. Power vacuums produced internal conflict and external intervention. The new order expanded faster than its stabilizing mechanisms could adapt. This mismatch created chronic instability across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Decolonization was not simply liberation, it was structural transformation under constraint. The post-war world did not resolve imperial legacies, it redistributed them. Understanding this explains why many post-war conflicts cannot be separated from the way the new order was constructed. The Cold War transformed ideology from a political preference into a marker of identity. States were no longer judged primarily by actions, but by alignment. Economic systems, political structures, and cultural expression became signals of loyalty. This polarization simplified global politics while intensifying conflict. Neutrality was increasingly viewed as instability rather than independence. Domestic politics became inseparable from foreign policy. Internal dissent was often framed as external threat. This dynamic hardened divisions and justified intervention. Ideology provided coherence to the new order, but at the cost of nuance. The world became legible in binary terms. This clarity reduced uncertainty for major powers while increasing pressure on smaller states. The post-war order thus traded complexity for control. Understanding this shift explains why conflicts after World War II were often framed as existential, even when material stakes were limited. Ideology turned regional disputes into global symbols. Belief became strategy. One of the most enduring consequences of the post-war order was the normalization of permanent mobilization. Peace no longer meant demobilization. Military industries remained active. Scientific research was integrated into defense planning. Governments institutionalized readiness. This condition reshaped economies and societies. Defense spending became structural rather than exceptional. Technological innovation was driven by security competition. Civilian life adapted to constant preparation. The memory of collapse justified vigilance. This system reduced the risk of surprise, but increased the cost of peace. Resources were permanently allocated to potential war. Political authority expanded under the logic of security. The post-war world accepted this trade-off. Stability was maintained through readiness rather than trust. Understanding permanent mobilization is essential. The post-war system succeeded in preventing another world war, but it did so by postponing resolution of underlying tensions. Conflicts were contained rather than solved. Borders were enforced rather than reconciled. Institutions managed competition without eliminating it. This approach produced stability, but not peace in the moral sense. Violence continued at lower intensity. Crises became recurring. The new order accepted this condition as preferable to catastrophe. Understanding this trade-off is crucial. The absence of global war was not the result of harmony. It was the product of constant management. Stability was maintained through control, deterrence, and compromise. Resolution was deferred indefinitely. This is why the post-war world feels simultaneously safe and unstable. The system works by preventing collapse, not by healing division. The post-war order was constructed under the shadow of memory. Leaders who designed it had lived through collapse. Their decisions reflected fear of repetition. Institutions were built to constrain behavior rather than inspire virtue. Memory shaped structure. The world that emerged was not ideal. It was resilient. This resilience came at the cost of tension and rigidity. The system endured because it assumed failure was always possible. World War II did not end chaos. It reorganized it. The new order institutionalized caution. Understanding this legacy is essential because it explains both the system's durability and its limitations. Memory does not fade in international politics. It hardens into rules. The post-war world remains governed by decisions made in the presence of ruin. This is the final lesson of Episode 8. History moves forward, but it carries its scars into every structure it builds.